G'day everyone and welcome back to Painting Oathsworn. Today's episode we are painting gold and hair and faces, and for that we've chosen the blade. Now the blade looks really interesting to play in the game, however the model itself is really comprised of only three separate elements: the cloak, the armour and the face. So making sure that we have an interesting looking figure will rely on ensuring that there is enough detail and interest in those elements. For the overlay colour on the gold, we actually are not using an overlay colour. Instead, we are going to undercoat the whole figure with a flat gold, and we're going to work in reverse, and we're going to shade down instead of highlighting up. Now, painting faces is a crucial part of miniature painting, as the face is where we're most often drawn to. So there's a few aspects to it that are important. The first being the value of the face and making sure that it is high enough and interesting enough. And secondly, making sure that there is enough warmth and interest in the face. Let's get to it. So I've taken a different approach on this figure, which is rather than starting from the darkest point and working upwards, I'm actually starting at a mid-tone and we're shading down. The value of this approach is you tend to have a more consistent and even base colour, and it allows your colours to sometimes be a little bit more vibrant. So I'm starting to add some shadows here, and I'm using the airbrush for this purpose because I think to get a really super shiny and smooth looking metal, the airbrush helps to contribute to that. But as always, in the world of the Deepwood, where everything is dirty and grimy, I do want to add some different layers of weathering and texturing. So here I'm using a charred brown, and the reason I've chosen charred brown, which is a Vallejo model air color that I've watered down, is I do want this particular color to be a matte finish. As I talked a lot about in the steel episode, the contrast between the shiny and reflective elements of the metal and the shadows being not shiny and reflective is a really key part of the whole illusion of metallic colors. So I'm adding this in a watered down wash to a lot of the recesses and just areas where I think there'll be shadow. So what we're trying to achieve out of this gold is a smoother looking result than we did with the steel. We want the gold to feel a little bit more looked after, a little bit more refined, but there still needs to be character, there still needs to be life. Starting with the mid-tone of the gold really allows us to have a more intense and vibrant and even base coat. So here we're just adding some contrast paint, and this is to add a little bit of warmth into the gold. So gold in general comes in a variety of different colors. You can have warm gold, you can also have older looking gold which can almost be greenish, you can have weathered gold, but here I want something that looks quite warm and new, and so I'm mixing in that Gorgrunter fur, which is a warm color. So as always, for all of the metallic colors, I have used my varnish, which has created that very matte look that you see right now. And I'm now going over the varnish with this metallic layer. And this is the same color that we use as our base color. What we're talking about here is exactly the same things we talked about in the other episodes, focusing on the light and thinking about the placement relative to our zenithal prime. We're looking at the way that we would highlight these elements if they were a non-metallic metal object, and thinking about how the other environmental factors would reflect on these elements. I really love this scale color, Dwarven Gold. For me, it's one of the best gold colors that I've painted with. It has such a really interesting, warm, vibrant finish, and as the same as the black metal, which is the steel color, it does have that slightly non-reflective tinge to it. It's still a reflective color, but if you put it side by side with a steel or another more metallic color, you do notice that it doesn't reflect quite as much. So I'm building up a transition between the matte until we get to the very last stages of the highlighted gold. The placement of these lights is consistent with the overall lighting of this figure. You will of course notice that the face and the hair have been painted already. We will come back to those later on in the video. The varnish layer has gone down and we are now dealing with the reflective elements, so the varnish had to go on before we started this, which means that the face had to be finished. So we'll come back to the face. So the main difference between gold and steel. Gold tends to reflect the environment a little bit less than steel does, and it tends to be a little bit less reflective overall. So the color I've mixed in here is a color called Elven Gold, which if you're a purist would be sacrilegious to paint Elven Gold over the top of Dwarven Gold, but I'm not a purist, these are just paints, so we're going to paint with them. The Elven Gold is a much shinier and much brighter color, and this is what will create the appearance of a very polished and looked after material. Now if you compare the way that I'm highlighting these elements to the way that I highlighted the steel parts, you'll see that I've got a lot less scratchy, short brush strokes. In fact, I'm treating this surface much the same way as I would skin or another element like that. We're really concentrating on the clear position of the highlights and wanting to establish that the light is reflecting in a very consistent and even way. When there's no little scratch details like that, you tend to see a much more polished and refined looking metal. Essentially, that's the only real difference versus how I painted the steel elements and how I've painted these gold elements on these figures. The gold I've treated as a little bit more polished and a little bit more looked after, and so there's less small minute scratches. But in terms of the placement of the lights, in terms of how we're considering these volumes, you can see that they're very, very consistent, aligned with exactly the same things as we did in the previous episodes. You can see the difference that these layers of gold have made to the overall look. If you skip back a few minutes and look at what it started like and to now, it's really chalk and cheese, and that's the value of having those matte colors as your base and creating that contrast between the reflective and the matte elements. So these little detailed parts on the legs, it's one of the trickiest parts about painting metal, is having those elements look like a part of the whole, but also having them look like individual elements. So highlighting them separately, it's important that we also incorporate them together with the main piece. We're mixing together our highlight color now, and as I'm sure you saw, we've added in some of the Vallejo Model Air Steel. It is one of my favorite colors for painting true metallics. It is a very reflective and vibrant color. It really sells the gold when you mix it in with this Elven Gold. Just creates that little pop of light. Still doesn't detract from the gold. Still feels like a gold element. But because it's got that higher level of reflectiveness, we're starting to really see that contrast come alive. Highly recommend model airbrush colors for something like this. Just that little bit more pigmentation and a little bit more dilute starting color just makes them a lot easier to work with for highlighting, for these really fine detail things. In fact, at any time you need to use a small brush but you still want to retain an intensity of pigment, I recommend starting with a model air color or mixing an ink into your normal paint instead of water. It'll really help retain vibrancy and allow it to flow a little bit easier. So we're just following the normal principles here of highlighting, looking at where the light would be coming from above and hitting those elements with this highlight color. This is really reflective. It's really creating the appearance of a shiny and polished gold. Treating each of these little pieces as a part of a larger whole, but also having this reflective light coming off them as well, is important to sell the illusion that this is a metal. Overall, when painting non-metallic metal versus true metal, the placement of the highlights is the only real change. And you can repeat that same conceptual change with true metallic paints, which will help your final result. Let's talk about painting hair. Hair is actually extremely similar to non-metallic metal in that it has a specific type of reflection that breaks the normal rules of highlighting. So it's a type of highlight called specular highlights, and all it is the light changes its position based on where you are standing as a viewer. Obviously, when we're painting models, we can't change the highlight as a person turns the model around. So all we have to do is pick a place for our highlights to be viewed from and try and make the rest of the elements look good at the same time. So we're starting with a base color here of green ochre, and I want to have this blade be a sandy brown blonde type of character. I also want his hair to be really bright. That's because he's going to be fighting against the gold and the white cloak. So I do want the hair to really stand out. So this is a sand yellow and this is a higher value, and I want to be very clear about why I'm placing these highlights in the specific position I am. So as I said, specular highlights are dependent on where you stand as a viewer. Rather than highlighting from the very top of the head, which is where you would expect the highlights to go if you were highlighting consistently to our zenithal prime, you can see I've moved those highlights down to the curve of the head, where it would be about 45 degrees on an angle from the actual position of the light. Because this is not a format that I can easily stop and draw diagrams and explain, I did actually do a quick visual demonstration of this in my original assembly video where I began some painting. But what we're looking for out of these highlights is to create the illusion of light reflecting off the hair in a way that is natural. So I won't go into it too much further. Let's shade the entire surface with this glaze color, and I'll talk about the second most important part about hair, which is not going too small too early. When you are looking at hair on a figure, that hair is representing hundreds and thousands of tiny little hairs. And one thing that you will see a lot of newer painters do is paint individual strands too soon. You really have to focus on the overall shape, the overall light reflectiveness of this entire hair volume before we go in and do those tiny individual strokes, which is what I'm doing here with this last highlight color. So remember, when painting hair, think about specular highlights and think about starting big and going small. Now this section on faces will be very, very similar to what we painted the human skin tones. However, I just wanted to zoom in and touch on a few little changes or a few little things to be aware of when painting faces. So I apologize that the clarity of the camera here is not as good as I would like it. So what we're looking at here is the first stages of highlights. And what I want to talk about when painting faces is really breaking the face down into key elements. So if you look at this face, and this is one of the best sculpted faces I believe in all of the heroes, we have several really clear shapes. So the first shape that we can see is the sphere on top of the head, which is his forehead. The next shape that we're looking at is the almost rectangular shapes of his eyebrows. And we then have the rectangular triangle of his nose, the cheekbones, which are spherical, and then the flat planes of his upper lip and the flat sphere of his chin. When you are highlighting a face, to really sell it as a interesting and alive looking face, we need to ensure that this area has as much contrast as other areas on the figure, if not more. So where we're really trying to create a lot of dynamic change between light and dark is right in these key areas. So as we progress through the stages of highlighting, and again we're using the same colors as we did in the original skin tutorial, which was several episodes ago, we are really creating a sharp contrast between those areas of light and dark. Now at this macro level, you can see that real change is quite apparent and probably doesn't feel quite correct. It looks a little bit too aggressively contrasted at this scale. But as we progress into the wider shots, which you'll see later on, you'll see that this area looks much more correct when we're zoomed out. All of these elements are about creating contrast in the face and creating a really dynamic and interesting looking face. When you have a high value in this area, and again a high value on the hair, you are more likely for this to grab the attention of your viewer and for that to be the focal point, which ultimately is what we want, because this is the key part. Second thing I wanted to talk about is just adding warmth. Now, this is just a thin glaze of a contrast paint, and all we're doing here is adding that little bit of extra life around this skin and around the face. It makes such a big difference in the final outcome to just have a little tiny hint of red in the face. So we move on to the final highlights, and you can see I've added a little bit more of that intensity of red in and around the face. And these final highlights, these pop highlights, are really about just adding that extra level of contrast. So you can see how much higher value the face is compared to these other elements and what a difference it's made. And that's it for this mega episode where we talked about painting gold, faces and hair. Our next episode will cover the topic of basing. There's a lot of different aspects to it that I want to talk about, and for that I have chosen the Grove Maiden. I look forward to seeing you in the next episode. Big Deno out.